Hey, folks, welcome to Isolation Bible Study. I'm glad you're here and glad you're with us today. We love these opportunities to hang out and be together, and we're trying something as kind of an experiment on these Mondays while we're doing. So let me back up. So during the summer, for the last several years, Concordia has been establishing a tradition of taking one of the books of Moses and working our way through that book during the summer months. And so we did Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and this year it's time to do Numbers. And as we were preparing this, as we were saying, if you were here and could hear some of our chatter beforehand, there's always more. Even when I'm preaching the message and Zach is teaching the adult Bible class, that's 90 minutes worth of teaching approximately. There's always more that we could cover that we can't get to because we just don't have the time to do that. And so we thought, hey, why don't we take a couple of the extra things that we'd like to talk about and add them in as sort of bonus content to the message, but do those on the Monday for Isolation Bible Study because we're still trying to figure out a format, trying to figure out the sustainability of all of this. And so that's kind of where the idea came from. And again, if it's interesting to you, if you like it when we finish, we'd love to know that. If you think it's kind of a silly thing to do, well, we can go back to doing something else, but we'd love your feedback and your input on how all of that works.
Yeah. And so we kicked off the series yesterday by taking a look at Numbers 1. And so just a quick, brief review. We kind of had 3 points on Numbers 1. Numbers 1 is a bunch of census data. And so it goes through the 12 tribes of Israel and counts 11 out of the 12 of them. We'll get to that a little bit later. But it counts 11 out of the 12 tribes of Israel. And one of the questions that a lot of people have about census data like that is, why in the world should I care? Why in the world does that matter to me?
Yeah, it seems like a waste, as you said in the message this weekend. Seems like a waste of good real estate, that God could have taken all of the various genealogies and census information in the Bible, which, by the way, doesn't just happen in Numbers, happens throughout the Scripture, and could have used that to answer a whole bunch of really, at least to us, important questions.
Speaking of which, just historically, one of the interesting things about biblical real estate is that there is, like, literally, physically, biblical real estate. I think a lot of folks know this. The original copies of the books of the Bible were not written in books. They were written on scrolls. And scrolls were made a certain length. And so one of the reasons that some of the biblical books are longer and shorter has to do with literal, physical real estate, because some scrolls were longer and some scrolls were shorter. And back then, scribes would write on scrolls, and parts and pieces of scrolls would sometimes fall off or get lost. And so literally, you kind of wonder, if you only have like a limited amount of scroll space, and scroll space was not cheap to come by like it is today. It was expensive to come by. Why would you spend a bunch of scroll space on a bunch of numbers? And so we talked about 3 points. And the first one was, we can learn something about history. This whole idea that even today, we do census work. We do genealogical work because we want to know who we are and where we've come from. There's a reason that once every few years, right, the government will literally do census data, because it helps us know something about who we are as a people. And if you get enough of that data over enough space and over enough time, you learn something about not only who we are as a people, but who we were as a people. And those who don't learn from the mistakes of the past are doomed to repeat them. And so Israel's doing the same thing.
Yeah, so point number 1 was that we can learn something about history. Point number 2 yesterday was that we can learn something about struggle, because what's interesting is that the census that's commanded by God. See, am I doing this right? Hold on my button. So point number 2. Point number 1 was the whole idea that we can learn something about history. Point number 2 is that we can learn something about struggle. And we understand that the census was of the entire 2 million or so Israelites, but specifically counting and naming those who were 20 years or older, the men, and able to serve in the army. So God was looking for a very specific subgroup within the whole group of Israel.
Yeah. And so the reason that he was looking for a subgroup is because God knew what was coming. He knew that they were going to struggle against themselves, their own sinfulness, and he knew that they were going to have to struggle against enemies as they got into the promised land. There are all these Canaanites and Jebusites and the Amalekites and a bunch of other ites who were living in the promised land, and they were going to have to fight these battles against these foreign people. And so God wanted to know upfront, right at the beginning of this journey, what do we have to work with? And we have the same questions, right? When we're worried about fighting the coronavirus or struggling against the coronavirus, what was one of the first questions that our government officials asked? Well, what PPE do we have to work with before you go into any battle? You always want to know, what kind of armies do you have? What numbers of soldiers do you have? And so it's just kind of a logical question.
Well, yeah. I mean, not only what PPE do we have, what drugs do we have that have been used for other kinds of things? So, yeah, we're looking for that. And the great news is that in any struggle and all struggle, we have a resource that trumps anything, any struggle, any trouble. We have Jesus. And I love that passage from John 16:33, where Jesus said, "In this world, you will have trouble." And if he'd stopped there, it would be overwhelming and intimidating, but he doesn't. In this world, you will have trouble. But then he says, "Take heart. I have overcome the world." And because he has overcome the world and he lives in us and he loves us and he loved us enough, he died for us, we can have great confidence in the face of any struggle. Which brings us to the third point.
Yeah, we can learn something about people. And so yesterday we talked about the reason that people are counted is because people count. People count to God. They matter to God. All of these census data numbers, all the names that are recorded in the census aren't just names on a list. Each and every one of them are names that matter to God. And we talked about how God is still in the business of collecting census data on his people. We talked about that great passage in Revelation where John sees a whole series of books where God collects census data on our works, our good and bad works. And if we're judged by that census data, it's lights out, game over. But there's another book that John sees in Revelation 20, and that doesn't have any of our works. It just has our name. And it's called the Book of Life. And if we're written in that book, okay, if our name is on that census roll, then we have eternal life. And the good news is we don't get there by our works, because it's not about our works. We get there by Jesus. He's the one who writes our name, kind of picturesquely, you could say, almost in his blood, because of the sacrifice that he has made. And God's still counting people, because to him, people still count.
Yeah, we talked about, I mentioned yesterday morning, which I didn't mention in the pre-recorded message, the whole idea that, on Sunday, as I was preparing for our in-person service and thinking about all of that, that the fact that everything that I have done, God has a record of that. And, I could say, well, I've done all kinds of good things. I've preached sermons and I've taught God's word and I've baptized babies and I've been kind to kittens and whatever else, right? God has a record of it all. And there's a lot of stuff on there that falls far short of his requirement of holiness. And it's very, very sobering when we think honestly about our lives and about that record. It becomes almost sort of a overwhelming thought. And the desperation is, man, if that's what gets counted, I'm in big trouble because I don't measure up. Thanks be to God, my deeds stay in that book, but my name gets transferred to the book of life. Yeah. And that's the wonderful message of the gospel, that we matter so much to God that when we were stuck in that other book and there was no way out and we were trapped by our own sinfulness, God provided a way through Jesus Christ, through faith, not by works, through faith, to have our names written in the book of life. Which brings us to the end of the message.
Yep.
But we've got 2 bonus points, as we mentioned yesterday,
Yep.
and as we mentioned at the beginning of this message. So let's dig in.
All right. So a couple of bonus points. We learned something about organization from the census data that we get in Numbers chapter 1. So here's kind of the interesting thing about Numbers 1. They do this big census in Numbers chapter 1. And if you get down to the end of the census, they add up the tribes of Israel. And in Numbers 1, verse 46, it says the total number was 603,550. Can you imagine counting all of those people, adding them all up to get that bottom line number. That is a huge number. A lot of scholars think that there were about 2 million people who trekked through the wilderness. And part of that is because these are just the soldiers in the army. These are like fighting men. And so by the time you add the other men, and then you add the ladies, and then you add the kids, you're hanging out at 2 million people who came out of Egypt into slavery.
You know, Zach, again, when I think about that, and I mentioned yesterday the tremendous blessing of having been in the Holy Land to see these different parts and places. And one of the places that we went was into this wilderness to see it. And so it's a barren place.
Yeah.
I mean, it is not somewhere where you can find food or just simply grow the food you want. There's almost no rainfall. So the thought of 2 million people being out there wandering around, I mean, simply couldn't have happened without God's provision. It's kind of overwhelming.
Yeah. In fact, next weekend, we'll do a little sneak preview. Next week's topic is how God provides in the book of Numbers, and he absolutely needs to provide in a very miraculous way, exactly because of what you said. So they count up all these people in Numbers 1. Now you get to Numbers 2, and here's the funny thing. You know what they do? They do it all over again. In fact, if you go to Numbers 2, verse 32, it says, "These are the Israelites counted according to their families, all the men in the camps by the same number, 603,550. And so they not only count once in Numbers 1, they count twice in Numbers 2. And this actually goes to something that you were saying yesterday. One of the things we hammer in to folks who take care of kids during our vacation Bible school, we have a little chant: count your kids, count your kids. If teachers take students on field trips, what do? Count their kids. Well, we got like a whole nation full of people on a field trip in the wilderness. And so what are they doing?
Counting their people.
Yeah, even when the total comes out to over 603,000. But we get something else in Numbers 2 when they count everybody again. The nation of Israel was divided into these 12 tribes. And these 12 tribes set up these individual camps. And we actually get the arrangement of the camps in Numbers 2. So I'll just read a few verses here. This is Numbers 2, verse 3. On the east toward the sunrise, the divisions of the camp of Judah are to encamp under their standards. So kind of think a flag, okay? The leader of the people of Judah is Nashon, son of Amminadab. His division, number 74,600. So they count everybody again. Then we go to like the tribe of Issachar, and they're going to camp next to the tribe of Judah. The leader of the people of Issachar is Nethanel, son of Zuar. His division numbers 54,400. And then like the tribe of Zebulun is next to the tribe of Issachar. And the leader of the people of Zebulun is Eliab, son of Helon. And his division numbers 57,400. And so again, you go through all of these different people, all of these different tribes with all of these different families and numberings. But here's kind of the key. You get this huge arrangement of all these tribes, but they're all organized around one building. And really, it's not a building. They're all organized around one tent known as the Tent of Meeting.
And so it gives us an idea, not only in terms of the organization of the people, but it gives us a picture of life organization, the life of that community of 2 million, the life of our very lives need to have an organization as well.
Exactly. So before all the counting of all the tribes starts, this is what God says to Moses in Numbers 2, verse 2. The Israelites are to camp around the tent of meeting, that tent, some distance from it, each of them under their standard and holding the banners of their family. Now, what is God getting at? Well, let's start with what the tent of meeting is. Another name for the tent of meeting is the tabernacle. And the reason it's also called the tent of meeting is because it's the place where you would go to meet with God. And so if you were to diagram it out, and people have done this, you can probably just Google, diagram Numbers 2. It'll probably pop up for you. You have all these tribes of Israel, and they're all organized around one place, one space, the tent of meeting, where the ancient Israelites believed the Lord dwelled, which kind of just gives us a beautiful picture of how our lives should be organized. Everything in our lives should be centered on and centered around God.
Yesterday, as folks were leaving after the 11 o'clock service, by the way, folks, I'll mention this again at the end of the message. We're actually going to move to one service on Sundays. You know, with this spike here in San Antonio and lots of people taking extra precautions, which I completely, we both do, completely support that happening and want you to take extra precautions. This is a season. We'll get through this season and things will go back to a more normal kind of an operation. But because those numbers are so low, just as a matter of stewardship, among other things, we're going to move to just one service at 9:30. But yesterday, as the folks were leaving, the very last couple to leave after the 11 o'clock service came out, and the man, was walking toward me, and he was just shaking his head, and I couldn't really see the expression on his face. And he looked up at me, and he had this big smile on his face. He said, "Pastor, man, have I missed being here." He said, "There's just something about being in the sanctuary that's so important for my soul," which I think kind of goes to the idea, right? There's something about being in a holy space that's dedicated to the worship and focus of God.
And so the whole Israelite community was, they were gathered around, quite literally, this holy space. Now, that's a beautiful picture. It is a very beautiful picture. And especially in a time like this, it can be a comforting picture, because when we're all spread out, thanks to the wonders of the internet, uh, we can do a lot. But there is something to be said for kind of that tent of meeting space. But it's also a challenging picture. And here's the reason why. Whether you come to church on a regular basis, on a semi-regular basis, or on a pretty much non-existent basis, everybody has a tent of meeting. In other words, everybody has something at the center of their life that they want to meet with a whole lot. For some people, it's money, right? I'm going to check my portfolio. I'm going to go to that tent of meeting again and again. And not only am I going to be wise with it, kind of stewarded, invested, I'm going to be totally anxious about it. It's going to consume my thoughts. It's going to consume my passions and my energy. And if anybody or anything else tries to kind of butt in on what I'm meeting with primarily in my life, I'm going to get a little sideways about it. And I'm going to get angry and upset. For other people, it's their own sense of pride, right? They have an image that they have made for themselves and that they are determined to keep and to maintain. And if anybody ever ever tries to say something that maybe kind of grates against their pride or against their sense of always being in the right, they're not going to listen. They're not going to ask, well, is this person just kind of being out of left field and not be really being truthful, maybe a little bit bitter toward me, or do they have something real to say to me? They refuse to let anyone get near their own ego, because that's what they meet with again and again. The question is not, do I have a tent of meeting? The question is, well, what's in the tent?
When it's so very true. And again, we see that in our own lives. We see that usually we see it more easily in the lives of others until we actually stop and pause. But Zach, one of the things that's happening during this time, there is a kind of a reset that's going on in our world, in our culture, because we're in such a strange time. And one of the issues that's being reset is people's focus on worship. One of the statistics that I've read recently that really concerns me is that at a minimum, 1 out of 3 Christian people have stopped worshiping altogether during this COVID-19 period, during this online worship. And that really kind of breaks my heart, and it concerns me, because we need to be leaning in. And that focal point of our lives, that tent of meeting focal point for our lives, needs to be maintained. And a part of that is worship, that worship has a priority over working out, that worship has a priority over work, that worship has a priority over everything, and that we continue to make that a priority, not only for ourselves, which is absolutely essential, but we continue to make that a priority for the sake of the people around us, and especially for the people for whom we have responsibility to pass on the faith and the traditions and the practices and the habits that surround our faith.
And I think, especially at this moment in time, we need faith more than ever. So next week, we're talking about how God provides. gee, I wonder if that's relevant during a time when we're kind of bracing for the worst economic quarter we will have seen in a real long time. In a couple of weeks, we'll be talking about anxiety. I was looking at some statistics. I was kind of toying around with some thoughts for the message that we're going to do, and the anxiety, just from a medical standpoint, is off the charts because people are so nervous and so worried about what's going to come next. And so the question is, where do you turn? Where do you go? Who do you meet with? And to leave God out of the equation, or to kind of relegate him to the sidelines, and you go, well, maybe I'll get back to that someday during a time like this day, it can get real overwhelming real quick. And so just the gentle invitation, right? Don't wait until you reach a breaking point where you go, oh, everything has fallen apart and I'm in over my head and I don't know what to do and where to turn. And so now I guess I need to get God back in my life, or I should probably talk to the pastor, or whatever the case may be. Do a little preemptive strike, right? On a totally wrecked life. Before you get to that point, start thinking through these things now. Start turning your attention to God now. Start thinking through the blessings and the promises of faith now.
Just as recently as this morning, I was doing a lot of reading about reopening schools as we're trying to get Concordia ready and fine tuning that plan. I was thinking about a number of other things and reading articles and tuning into this information about this quarter and the implications of all of that. And I will tell you that I reached a point where I could feel the stress rising inside of me, to the point that I actually just turned it off.
Yeah.
Just turned it off, and the stress was still there, and the anxiety was still there, and I had to remind myself, my hope is not in all of that. My hope is in God, and God's got this. And that's not something where you say it, there's a magic switch that goes off and all of that goes away. You've got to work to remind yourself, that's my tent of meeting. That is the center of my life, and that's where my hope comes from.
And so getting our lives organized, especially during a time like this, when everything feels a little crazy, is critical. And it's right out of the book of Numbers, which is part of the thing I think we've seen over and over again in these books. These books are so relevant and so practical, and they have so much to teach us. So
we talked about running out of time.
Yep.
So you've got one point. We're going to be lucky to get to the next point, but fire away, Zach.
All right. So final thing that we can learn, that we want to talk about, is we can learn something about sacrifice. We can learn something about sacrifice. I teased this earlier. There are 12 tribes of Israel, and in the census, 11 out of the 12 of them are counted. Here's the tribe that is left out. This is Numbers 1, verse 47. The ancestral tribe of the Levites, however, was not counted among the others. The Lord had said to Moses, you must not count the tribe of Levi or include them in the census of the other Israelites. Instead, I want you to appoint the Levites to be in charge of the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, of the covenant law, over all its furnishings, everything belonging to it. They are to carry the tabernacle, all its furnishings. They are to take care of it. They are to encamp around it. And so the Levites are the ones who are supposed to take care of the thing that everything else is organized around, which is the tent of meeting. Now, here's why this is so incredibly important. So the Levites were a tribe that were charged with two things. They were charged with taking care of the tents of meeting, which is what's mentioned here in Numbers 1. But then out of the Levites also came a class of priests, and they were the ones who were charged with making sacrifices in Old Testament Israel. Now, here's the reason this is really important. The Israelites have all these fighting men that are counted up. And how do we put this delicately? The fighting men kind of blow it. You fast forward a few chapters, and the Israelites are getting close to the promised land. And so Moses and Aaron send some guys into the promised land to kind of do a bit of reconnaissance, to check it out, to see who's there. And they come back with this report and they say, well, the land's awesome. It has fruit and milk and honey. It's really, really good. Much better than the desert of Sinai where we're living right now. But there are these people, and these people are big, like real big. They work out. They're tall, right? In fact, so just a little a little Hebrew. They talk about them as the descendants of Anak. Now the Hebrew word Anak means somebody who has a long neck, and so the idea is, oh, these people look like giraffes to us. They're super tall, and you know what they do? They decide not to go in. In other words, the people who should have been leading the charge, who should have been saying, well, you know what? We've counted this. We've trained for this. We're ready for this. Because what happened in Numbers 1? They say, no.
Part of my devotion this morning, I was thinking about this very text and this whole section. And my thought was, what would have happened if they, instead of even asking God to be able to send these spies in, what if they would have just said, yeah, God, we're going. If you're with us, we're going. What would have happened? We know what would have happened. They would have been victorious. They would have had an amazing experience, not without struggle and challenge, but God would have prevailed as always he does. And it makes me think about the fact that we're on the cusp of a new era, right? Things will be different. Now, maybe not as different as some prognosticators suggest, but we know that going into the fall and through the fall and for a period of time, things are going to be different. And this economic recovery is going to take years instead of months. We're on the edge of a new land. And the question is, are we going to allow ourselves to be psyched out and terrified and pulled back and miss the opportunity? Or are we going to say, you know what? We've got God. And look at everything that he's done in the past. Look at his faithfulness, not just in Scripture. Look at his faithfulness in my life and in your life, in the lives of our congregation, the lives of Christianity and Christian people all over the world. We can march forward into this with absolute confidence because it never did depend on the soldiers. No. It always depended upon God.
And that's the thing. So the soldiers blow it. The people who are supposed to be fighters blow it. So here's the question we're left with. Okay, so if the fighters can't handle this, how's Israel going to survive? What is going to save Israel? So here's the amazing thing. When the Israelites finally do make it into the promised land, what do? They sacrifice. They're led by the priests. In fact, it's the Ark of the Covenant, which is where the Israelites believe that God sat, that actually leads them across the Jordan River, which is the body of water that separates them from the promised land. They're saved. They're led by those who sacrifice, interestingly enough, not by those who fight. Now, ultimately, we got to ask ourselves, in this world, it can be real easy to want to get into a fight. Pretty much all you got to do is hop on any version of social media and you'll want to get into a fight with somebody over something. But how are we going to make this world a better place? How are we going to get through this? What's really going to make the difference and turn the page? Honestly, it's not going to be led by those who are always up for a fight, because they're either going to become cowardly or sometimes they're just going to become obnoxious. But it can be led by those who sacrifice, by those who are willing to give of their time or their effort or their resources, their heart for other people. Why? Because ultimately, the Christian faith is led by one who sacrifices, and that's how he wins the victory.
So there are our 2 bonus points, and I hope they were a blessing to you. We're just about out of time. I mentioned I want to talk about 2 things. One, I don't think we mentioned at the beginning. So Jack and I are planning, except for a couple of messages that are being preached by other folks. Yep. You and I are going to do these numbers messages as a tag team, and we'll see. People may be sick of it by the time it's done, but we'll work our way through all of that. But so we're doing that. I also mentioned a little earlier, we're going to make a shift in our Sunday morning in-person worship. Now, realize if you're worshiping at home, if you're worshiping online, nothing will change. All of those services will continue to not only go off on the times when they're scheduled, but they'll continue to be available pretty much around the clock afterwards, so that you can worship at whatever time. And my encouragement and my prayer as your pastor who loves you, make a time, set a time, and devote it to that period of worship. Let that be a part of the tent of meeting with God in your life. But on Sunday morning, we're going to move from 2 services to 1 service. And that 1 service is going to be at 9:30. Now, you may say, well, wait a minute, can we still show social distance and all of that? The answer is absolutely we can. We have the ability to do that. We've been doing a great job. Stacy Bond and the rest of the staff have been amazing in making that all work well. So we've got plenty of room. The numbers have been small, and I suspect they'll be small until things begin to calm down again. And so as soon as we're able, as soon as registration numbers go up, we'll add services back in, and that'll be honestly, I hope it's the next couple of weeks, but I think it might be just a little bit longer than that. So worship at 9:30. I'll be sending a note out to the congregation, and we'll have that on our webpage as well for people to register, because we'll still need folks to register for those worship services. But I wanted to mention that before we finish up, Zach.
So I think that's all the time we have.
So we love you. We hope you had a good time with us. Numbers is an amazing book, and I think you're going to enjoy it as we continue our way through this summer. God bless you. Have a great Monday afternoon.